My name is Elena Thorne, and I am 30 years old. For 3 decades, the Thorns of Charleston have stood as the gold standard of Southern reputation. My father, Richard, is a respected state judge. My mother, Beatrice, chairs every prestigious committee in South Carolina. In our world, a polished image isn't just a lifestyle, it's a religion. But 10 years ago, that religion demanded a human sacrifice, and my family decided I was the one who had to go. They didn't just kick me out, they erased me. They told the world I was unstable, a thief, a stain on a legacy they spent 40 years building. For a decade, I was the ghost in their attic, the name spoken in hushed, shameful whispers at country club dinners. But here is what my parents and my golden brother Julian never expected. Truth has a funny way of surviving in the dark. I didn't spend those 10 years rotting. I spent them building a life they couldn't even imagine. And last Saturday, at our family's grand centennial reunion, I walked back into that lion's den with a single manila envelope in my hand. Inside wasn't just paper. It was the result of a DNA test that was about to turn their precious reputation into a pile of ashes. Before the night was over, the town's elite would find out who the real liar in the Thorne family actually was. If you've ever been the scapegoat to protect someone else's secret, this story is for you. Welcome back to the channel, where we dive into the real, raw stories of family dynamics and life-changing moments. If you've ever felt like you were the one carrying the weight for someone else's mistakes, you aren't alone. I see you, and your worth isn't defined by the labels they gave you. Before we get into the night that changed everything, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and join our community. It helps us grow and share more stories of resilience and truth. Also, I truly love hearing from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was the label your family gave you? I read every single one of your messages. Now, let's go back 10 years to that humid July night in Charleston when my world fell apart, and I learned exactly what my parents were willing to sacrifice to protect their reputation. To understand the DNA test in my hand, you have to understand the hierarchy of the Thorne house. In Charleston, there are families with money, and then there are families with names. We were the latter. My brother Julian was the son, and the rest of us were just supposed to rotate around him, making sure he looked bright. He was the athlete, the future lawyer, the one my father bragged about over cigars at the club. I was just Elena, the one who made the grades but didn't need the applause. The reliable one. The one who did the heavy lifting so Julian could take the victory lap. It was a Tuesday in early September when the Golden Boy's mask finally cracked. I remember the air was thick with that coastal humidity, the kind that makes everything feel heavy. I walked into my father's study, a room that smelled of old leather and expensive bourbon, and found my parents standing over Julian like he was a broken piece of heirloom porcelain. Julian was crying, but it wasn't the cry of someone who was sorry. It was the cry of someone who had been caught. Over $50,000 had disappeared from the local youth literacy fund. My father was the chairman, but Julian had been given the opportunity to manage the accounts to build his resume for law school. He hadn't invested it, and he hadn't lost it. He had gambled it away on high-stakes offshore sites. If this went public, my father's judgeship was over. The Thorne reputation wouldn't just be tarnished, it would be incinerated. My father looked at me, not with love, but with a cold, calculated precision. "Elena," he said, his voice as sharp as a gavel, "Julian has a future. He is going to be a pillar of this community. You haven't started your path yet. You're flexible." There was that word again, flexible. It was their way of saying my life was expendable. They didn't ask, they told me. I was to take the fall. I was the one with access to the accounts. I was the one who was struggling with the pressure. My mother, Beatrice, stepped toward me, her silk dress rustling like a snake in the grass. She didn't hug me. She adjusted my collar and whispered, "It's for the family, Elena. We will take care of the legal side. It will be a youthful indiscretion, but Julian must remain clean. The reputation of this family depends on it." I looked at Julian. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He just sat there, letting our parents dismantle my life to save his. I refused. For the first time in 20 years, I said no. I told them I wouldn't bear the mark of a thief for a brother who didn't even have the courage to stand up. The shift in the room was instant. The warmth, what little there was, vanished. My mother's face hardened into a mask of pure venom. "If you won't protect this name," she hissed, "then you don't get to carry it." By midnight, my bags were packed. My father didn't even come out of his study to say goodbye. My mother stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching me like I was a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. She told me that from that moment on, Elena Thorne didn't exist. They would tell the town that I had been sent away for rehabilitation because of my issues. They would tell the world I was the liar, the thief, the unstable daughter. I walked out of that house with $300 and a suitcase. As I drove away from the wrought iron gates of our estate, I saw Julian's silhouette in his bedroom window. He was already back on his phone, probably placing another bet, knowing his sister had just been sacrificed to keep his throne intact. They thought they had buried the scandal. What they didn't realize was that they had buried it in the one person who knew exactly where the bodies were hidden. Seattle in October is nothing like Charleston. In Charleston, the air is a warm, humid hug that smells of jasmine and old money. In Seattle, the rain is cold, needle-like, and constant. For the first 2 years, that rain felt like it was trying to wash away the Elena I used to be. I started in a studio apartment in a neighborhood where nobody knew the name Thorne, and thank God for that. To them, I wasn't a disgraced daughter or a thief. I was just the girl in Unit 4B who worked 3 jobs and lived on instant noodles and gas station coffee. I remember my father's words, the only ones that weren't a judgment, from a letter he'd slipped me years before. "Build something they cannot ignore." I took those words and made them my foundation. While Julian was likely at some high-end bar in South Carolina, spending the money our parents had protected for him, I was working the graveyard shift as a lab assistant in a medical testing facility. By day, I was putting myself through a master's program in forensic genetics. My life was a cycle of sterile latex gloves, the hum of centrifuges, and the blue light of computer screens. I didn't have time for a social life, and I certainly didn't have time to miss a family that had traded me for a clean reputation. By the time I was 27, the girl who had been kicked out with $300 was gone. In her place was a woman who was a senior analyst at one of the top genetic research firms in the Pacific Northwest. I had my own place, a minimalist condo with a view of the Sound, and a reputation of my own, one built on precision and truth, not lies and silk dresses. But families like mine have a way of haunting you even from 3,000 miles away. Every few months, I'd get a text from an old school friend or a distant aunt who hadn't quite got the memo to block me. "I saw your mom at the gala," they'd say. "She told everyone you were still traveling to deal with your condition." Or, "Julian just got promoted to the board of the foundation. They're calling him the savior of the Thorne legacy." It was a cold Tuesday in November when the ghost finally walked through my front door, digitally speaking. My father had suffered a minor heart scare. It wasn't publicized, but because of my position in the industry, I had access to certain medical database notifications when family records were updated for hereditary screenings. I saw the filing for a marrow compatibility test. Julian had been the first choice for a donor, as the only son. I sat in my office, the city lights of Seattle blurring outside my window, and looked at the results that had been quietly uploaded into the private portal. As a geneticist, I see patterns. I see markers. I see things that the average person, and even some doctors, might overlook. Julian's markers didn't just fail a compatibility test for a marrow match, they failed the basic laws of biology. I ran the sequence again, then a third time. My heart was thumping against my ribs so hard it felt like it would bruise. The data didn't lie. Julian wasn't a match for my father because Julian wasn't my father's biological son, the golden boy, the one they had sacrificed me for, the one whose reputation was so vital to the Thorne name that I had to be erased from existence. He was a lie, a living, breathing, walking lie that my mother had been guarding for over 30 years. She hadn't just blamed me for Julian's crimes to save the family name. She had disowned her own flesh and blood to protect a secret that went far deeper than a gambling debt. I looked at the folder on my desk, the one I had started keeping the day I left Charleston. It was my version of the truth, a collection of every lie they'd told, every card they'd returned, and every smear they'd put on my name. But now, I had something much more powerful than a binder of grievances. I had the code. For months, I did nothing. I watched from afar as Julian's face appeared in Charleston social magazines. I watched my mother host charity auctions for at-risk youth, playing the role of the saintly matriarch while she harbored a secret that would dismantle her world. I waited until the right moment, and that moment arrived in the form of a thick, cream-colored invitation to the Thorne family centennial reunion. They wanted a show of unity. They wanted to celebrate 100 years of Thorne excellence. They thought I was too broken, too far away, and too unstable to show up. They were wrong. I wasn't going back to ask for an apology. I was going back to deliver a verdict. I spent that week preparing my evidence, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical precision of the scientist I had become. They wanted to protect their reputation? Fine. I was going to show them exactly what that reputation was worth. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside my mailbox in Seattle. It was a thick, cream-colored card with gold-embossed lettering that read, "The Thorne Family Centennial, a Century of Excellence." The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, my mother's elegant, sharp script that looked more like a series of tiny daggers than letters. For 10 years, she hadn't called to ask if I was alive or dead, but for this century of excellence, she needed me to complete the picture. She probably thought 10 years of exile had broken me enough that I would come running back at the first sign of a formal invitation. I sat on my balcony, feeling the cold Seattle wind on my face as I stared at that golden lie. A century of excellence? It wasn't excellence. It was a 100-year-old tower of cards built on the sacrifices of people like me. My mind went to Julian, the golden boy, for whom they had erased my existence. Then I looked at my laptop where the data sat, the genetic markers proving he wasn't even the heir they thought they were protecting. My therapist used to ask what I wanted from them. For years, my answer was an apology. But holding that invitation, I realized an apology was too small. I didn't want them to just say they were sorry. I wanted them to realize they were wrong. I wanted to be the mirror they were too afraid to look into, much like the architecture student who found her own reflection in her mother's old sketchbook. I spent the next 3 days in the lab. I didn't just print the DNA results. I prepared a full dossier. I pulled old bank statements from 10 years ago that Julian thought were long gone. I gathered every receipt my father had ever tried to hide in his study. I put it all into a plain manila envelope. It felt heavy in my hands, like the physical weight of 10 years of silence finally ready to be offloaded. I booked a one-way ticket to Charleston. I didn't pack much, but I packed my best suit, dark navy, sharp-shouldered, professional. It was a suit that shouted I didn't need their money or their name because I had built my own. When the plane touched down in the humid South Carolina air, I felt that old tightness in my chest. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was a cold, clinical focus. The Thornes wanted a reunion. I was about to give them a reckoning. The Thorne estate looked exactly as it had 10 years ago, manicured, expensive, and cold. Wrought iron gates opened to a lawn filled with white marquees and the elite of Charleston. The scent of blooming lilies was heavy in the humid air, but to me, it smelled like hypocrisy. As I stepped out of my car, I felt 50 pairs of eyes lock onto me. I wasn't the disheveled girl they had chased away. I was a woman in a navy suit with a manila envelope that held their expiration date. I saw my mother, Beatrice, at the center of a circle of socialites. She was wearing a pearl-colored silk dress, playing the role of the grand matriarch. When she saw me, her glass of champagne tilted slightly, but her face remained a mask of polite, frozen horror. She didn't come to hug me. She walked over, her voice a sharp whisper meant to cut. "Elena, you were told to stay away. Do you have no respect for this family's reputation?" "I'm just here for the centennial, Mother," I said, my voice steady enough to draw the attention of the people nearby. "A century of Thorne excellence, right?" Julian was there too, standing next to our father. He looked every bit the golden boy in his tailored blazer, laughing with a local congressman. He caught my eye and smirked, a look that said he still thought he was untouchable because our parents had built a fortress of lies around him. The evening progressed like a scripted play. My father, Judge Richard Thorne, stood up for the keynote toast. He spoke about legacy. He spoke about integrity. And then he did exactly what I knew he would do. He looked toward me, standing at the edge of the crowd, and used me as a prop for his narrative of forgiveness. "We've had our challenges," he told the crowd, his voice booming with judicial authority. "Even the strongest trees have branches that go astray. Our daughter Elena has struggled, as many of you know, but we hope that being back among a family of high character will finally guide her toward the truth." The guests offered me looks of pity, the kind you give a broken thing. That was the spark. Beatrice leaned in and added, loud enough for the front 3 tables to hear, "It's a shame, really. After the theft 10 years ago, we just wanted her to find peace, but some people are just built to fail." That was it. The same lie. The same public execution of my character to keep Julian's pedestal high. I didn't wait for the applause. I walked straight to the microphone. The silence that fell over the garden was absolute. "My father is right about one thing," I said, the speakers echoing my voice across the estate. "Integrity is the only thing that matters. But you can't have integrity when your entire house is built on a foundation of genetic and financial fraud." I opened the manila envelope. I felt my heart thumping, not with fear, but with the cold, clinical precision of a scientist delivering a lab report. 10 years ago, a Thorne stole $50,000 from a youth charity. My parents told you it was me. They told you I was unstable. But I have the original bank transfers Julian made to an offshore gambling site. And I have the logs of the emails my father sent to the bank to suppress the investigation. A gasp rippled through the elite of Charleston. I saw my father's face turn a shade of gray I'd never seen before, but I wasn't done. "But that's just money," I continued, pulling out the blue-stamped DNA report. "Let's talk about blood. Let's talk about the Thorne legacy that my mother sacrificed me to protect." I looked directly at Beatrice. She was shaking, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "I am a senior genetic analyst. I deal in markers, patterns, and biological facts. When my father needed a marrow match recently, I saw the records, and here is the fact that the Thorne reputation can't survive. Julian is not a Thorne." The silence was so heavy it felt like it would crack the pavement. Julian stepped forward, his face red with rage. "You're lying. You're just bitter because you were kicked out." "Patterns don't lie, Julian," I said, holding up the report. "This is a certified DNA comparison. You share 0 paternal markers with Judge Richard Thorne. My mother didn't disown me to protect a Thorne heir. She disowned me to protect the secret of her own affair 30 years ago. She sacrificed her biological daughter to save the reputation of a son who isn't even part of this lineage." I walked to the main table and laid the documents down in front of the local congressman and the Hendersons. I saw them lean in. I saw the realization hit their faces. The Thorne reputation wasn't just tarnished. It was gone. In 60 seconds, they went from the town's royalty to the town's biggest scandal. My mother collapsed into her chair, her head in her hands. My father looked at Julian like he was looking at a ghost, a stranger who had been occupying his home for 3 decades. And Julian, the golden boy, looked like a hollow shell. The mask was off. The truth was out. And for the first time in 10 years, I could finally breathe the air in Charleston. The silence that followed my revelation wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, the kind of silence that happens right after a fatal crash. My mother, Beatrice, tried one last desperate move. She stepped toward me, her eyes darting to the guests who were already whispering and checking the documents I'd left on the table. "Elena, you've always had such a vivid imagination," she said, her voice trembling, but still trying to maintain that ironclad Thorne composure. "This is just another one of your episodes. We can talk about this inside, privately." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a formidable matriarch. I saw a scared woman standing in a garden of lies she'd spent 30 years watering. "There is no more private, Mother," I said, my voice echoing through the silent marquees. "The truth doesn't need a room with a locked door. It's out now. You didn't protect a reputation, you protected a fraud at the cost of your daughter." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a formidable matriarch. I saw a scared woman standing in a garden of lies she'd spent 30 years watering. "There is no more private, mother," I said, my voice echoing through the silent marquise. "The truth doesn't need a room with a locked door. It's out now. You didn't protect a reputation. You protected a fraud at the cost of your daughter." I looked at the ground, the golden boy crown finally shattered at his feet. My father didn't say a word. He just stared at the DNA report as if he could rewrite the biology with a judicial order. He couldn't. I didn't wait for them to apologize. I realized then that I didn't need their sorry to be whole. I had built a life in Seattle that was made of steel and facts, while theirs was made of silk and secrets. As I walked back toward the wrought iron gates, the air in Charleston felt lighter. I left the folder on the table. I left the house, the name, and the expectations behind. As I drove toward the airport, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. If they hadn't disowned me, I might have spent my life helping them polish those lies. Instead, I had become my own witness. Truth is a clinical thing, but it's also a freeing one. You cannot restore a family that refuses to be fixed, but you can build a life that doesn't need their approval to stand. I was never the unstable one. I was just the only one who could see through the fog. If this story reminded you of your own worth, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our community. Your support helps us share more stories of truth and resilience. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to walk away to find yourself? I'll see you in the next one.